Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and coming to our first event in the Staying Close to Loss event series. My name is Ivor Williams. I'm the associate of the Stewarding Loss project. And as designer, I'm the lead for end-of-life care at the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College London. My work is grounded in using design to transform our relationship to dying, death, and loss. And honestly, I'm so happy that you're here today as we begin this series. And I'm also joined behind the scenes by Iona Lawrence, who along with Cassie Robinson is the co-founder of the Stewarding Loss project. So Stewarding Loss is a collective of organizational designers, social innovators, and coaches. It began as an idea by Cassie Robinson, who felt that there was little conversation, let alone action, when it comes to the idea of renewal in civil society. By civil society, we broadly mean all the charities, social enterprises, and nonprofits and organizations that represent what can be called the third sector, outside of private and governmental sectors. And by renewal, we mean the natural regenerative cycles of life and death, which expresses the notion that things fade in their relevance and feed and shape things that come after. And this work of stewarding loss is very urgent. As COVID-19 devastates civil society, we know that many organizations won't really survive. An emerging reality in the nonprofit sector in the UK is that 1 in 10 organizations could face closure as a result of the pressures of the pandemic. So our countries and our economies are facing incredible challenges, and this work is centered around the desire to find ways to cope with these challenges and to support civil society. Essentially, stewarding loss extends to contribute to a wider systemic shift, whereby organizational endings and closures are considered within strategies of organizations to be as ordinary as growth. And really, it's about practically supporting organizations, considering, facing, or designing a closure at this time with a practical and emotional guidance and signposting to support. But it considers that every organization, nonprofit and charity and enterprise is founded, led and supported by people for whom grief, loss and endings can be terrifying things to open up to discuss and to work with. And so that brings us to today. The purpose of this event series, which begins tonight, is to provide thought-provoking stimulus to deepen and broaden our relationship of an understanding of the cycles of death, loss and rebirth, and the role of renewal in health ecosystems of all kinds. By positioning this work in a longer time frame, these events connect civil society to consider and prepare for the losses other crises will bring, like the ecological and climate emergency. I'm really happy and really grateful that you've taken the time out of your weekends to join us on this conversation. And so in conversation with me today is Stephen Jenkinson. Stephen is a teacher, author and ceremonialist. He is the creator and principal instructor of the Orphan Wisdom School, which he co-founded with his wife, Nathalie Roy, in 2010. The Orphan Wisdom School is for anyone with a desire to be useful to those who will inherit an endangered and often dangerous world. He is the author of many books, including Come of Age, The Case of Elderhood in Time of Trouble, and award-winning Die Wise, a manifesto for Sanity and Soul. He was subject of a National Film Board of Canada documentary Griefwalker, which I highly recommend. And recently, Stephen offered a live stream speaking series, A Generation's Worth, Spirit Work While the Crisis Rules, and a new book, I understand, is scheduled for publication later this year. Stephen is also, above all that, an accomplished musician, and he's released 2 records at the end of 2020 with his Nights of Grief and Mystery project with singer-songwriter Gregory Hoskins. And they were all set and ready for a large tour of 70 cities across the world with their Rough Gods World Tour when COVID hit and changed everything. I was personally first introduced to Stephen through his experiences in palliative care, but his worldview and his wisdom reaches much farther than that. His work, I think, is described as a spiritual activist, I think is particularly a powerful lens through which to consider our conversation tonight. So we'll be in dialogue for about 45 minutes, and I hope we'll have enough time to save some questions at the end. So for anything that's raised in the discussion. We'll have the Q&A function in Zoom. If you want to submit any questions, we'll try our best if there's time. So good evening to me, but good afternoon to you, Stephen. How are you?
How am I? This would take the 45 minutes. So let's just say I'm lucky to be upright in a place that's kind to my uprightness. It's a pretty good deal.
Yeah, I understand you're calling from Oaxaca.
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I hope Oaxaca is treating you well.
So far, so great. Yes, thanks.
Okay. So, Stephen, I would like to kind of open this kind of conversation by framing for everyone joining us about where we're meeting everyone as they are. As you just described, we're meeting you as you are today as well. And for those who are joining us, you may have heard of this event through the Stewarding Loss and the work that they've been doing. You may know Stephen himself and his work, or you may have not heard much about Stephen. So I feel like we're all together right now, connected to the internet with a number of shared feelings. So I'd first like to acknowledge that we are still very much living in this middle of this pandemic, which is causing a whole amount of grief and loss. And so I feel like we want to find an equilibrium here today of opening up to those feelings of grief and loss while respecting that tenderness. And I feel like this, discussions of grief and loss may leave us feeling a bit raw, but personally, I feel like this is a space for us to connect over those feelings. Stephen, first of all, the issue of unpacking death illiteracy in Western society. You said in an interview last year that the North American response to the COVID-19 outbreak in the West's death illiteracy distorted our ability to plan and to think ahead to mitigate various problems such as containing a virus or responding to the climate change. Can you explain a bit more about this notion of death illiteracy and how it really affects us?
I could, let me add to the context that you established. We're in the West, you and I, and probably most people listening, which makes us all postmodernists, whether we agree that that's the case or not, which means we have made a home in a kind of wreckage, cultural wreckage, imagining that that's the latest, greatest leap forward in personal freedom. And then we have a plague, and then we have the screen that is both enabling us to be in touch, and if we can be honest with each other, is disabling in many ways as well. Yeah. So, and then, the notion of grief illiteracy, I should say that I might sound authoritative from time to time during the course of this talk, but that's a temporary lapse of judgment to sound that way, I think it's better to say the best I can come up with right now on relatively short notice, because I'm only 66, I'm just sort of getting rolling. This should be taken with that in mind. Okay. So grief illiteracy, well, let's start with the second word first. Why would you call it illiteracy and not discomfort or disability? Answer is because I'm trying to suggest by the phrase that there's nothing inevitable about grief appearing in a circumstance or an encounter that seems to plead and beg and moan for it. This I learned in my time in the death trade, and it's a very portable understanding from the deathbed, from the literal, deathbed of an individual, to the deeply unsought but clearly underway beginnings of the death throes of an entire way of life, or a way of anti-life, which the West is famous for across the world, really. So I'm suggesting then, if grief is not inevitable, then it must be an achievement of a sort, not of the sought out kind, not of the kind that breeds comfort or even a sense of mastery. I would say even emphatically not a sense of mastery. I mean, after all, if you're grieving, there's not a part of you that's enthralled with the rest of you grieving. And that part of you is above the fray and happy to observe. I I mean, there's no such event in the context of grief. That's melancholy, if you will, but there's nothing melancholic about grief. So if grief's not inevitable, and if it is indeed some kind of achievement or skillfulness, as I've been claiming, then it would appear to me to be the case from all the forensic encounters that I had in the matter, that grief has to be learned, because it's clear that very, very few of us are born with the chops, born with the inclination, or even the willingness to consider that it is a mandate of conscious three-dimensional life to be able to grieve, right? And it's a counterintuitive ability, if you will, because normally we understand ability to be something that lends credence and comfort and a sense of well-being. But grief doesn't participate in that kind of cereal box wisdom, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be learned then. And if it has to be learned, then there has to be some kind of educating environment, some kind of enabling environment that is not only friendly to grief, but overtly practices its many cantos, let's say. If you don't happen to be born in such a place, I certainly was not. My guess, you weren't either. It puts us so desperately behind things as a start that in fact, we don't imagine starting this. We imagine waiting to be on the receiving end of this upswell of naturally occurring skillfulness called grief. I can tell you from being at so many deathbeds that much more often than not, these were grief-free events. And that's an enormously sad observation to make, but grief was not forthcoming. Grief had to be dragged into the proceedings more often than not. And this is not a consequence of Anglo-Saxon stiff upper lipedness, I should say, because this was true across a number of different kinds of demographics and populations, including the fact that I had a good number of Holocaust survivors, obviously very aged by this point, or families of Holocaust survivors in the realm of experience I'm describing here now. And I promise you this, they as a group were no more adept at grieving than anyone was. And that by itself should take somebody's breath away. Just the thought that a circumstance so pervasively grim and uncalled for, and so many other things we could say about it, didn't predispose anyone to be able to grieve when the moments called for it, yeah? Okay, so then finally, what do you mean by grief? Now that we've talked about the illiteracy part of things. Grief, in my understanding of it, is a consequence of life having seized you by the scruff and you having been defeated by life. That's where it comes from. This is a bit of an overture, perhaps, to the rest of what we're going to talk about. Mm-hmm. But the gist of the understanding would be that grief is not mastery. Grief is the end of mastery and the beginning of, as my countryman Leonard Cohen called it, reading from the manual of defeat, right? And this is what makes us human beings, humble human beings, or should, in a world that requires our humanity while not requiring more of us to be born. Grief is part of the repertoire of submission to the fact that life is bigger than your life, and that the meaning of life is not what you insist that it is. Your insistence is part of the meaning of life, but by no means its author. See? So in other words, it's a recipe for a kind of psychic one step down from the summit orientation, right? And for all of that, it's enabling in a way that most of my fellows don't seek.
This idea of enabling and skillfulness.
Yeah.
there's no, so the framing of like this event series, this project that we're talking about specifically is calling up the blind spot in, you know, many people's life experiences, that they don't have any skillfulness or any kind of mastery of it. Is there any kind of, not to try and think about like what are the practical steps to kind of bring people around to engaging with this earlier, but like, is it cause of an amputation? I'm just thinking of the Holocaust. You're describing the Holocaust survivors. Was it an amputation, a cultural amputation, or is it something that's just withered away in our kind of various cultures as a result of whatever the prevalent 21st, 20th century kind of systems kind of push down? Okay. Is it a slow withering or a amputation?
Well, I hope there are more than two options for wondering how it came to be. First of all, I would say there's nothing sudden about it. Okay, it's probably in my corner of the world, in Anglo-North America, it is a consequence of, in a phrase, the middle passage. That is, that when the likes of you got on the boats at Plymouth and otherwise, and turned into the likes of me, X number of generations down the road, one of the things that you lost was any kind of a sense of cultural continuity. Oh, it was with you, of course, because you had no choice in the matter. But as you had progeny, and as you encouraged them to self-identify, the last thing you probably did was encourage them to know themselves as the products and the proud sons and daughters of the place that you abandoned. You follow what I'm saying? So the consequence is a kind of radical cultural discontinuity. It turns into a kind of pseudo identity. And one of the losses was the shared understanding of what becomes you as you fray at the edges, as you become less capable, and finally as you enter into the time of no return, and finally as you die, right? When you have an enormous mix of people who have no shared understanding of what happens to you as you're dying, when you die, and thereafter, and you have no shared understanding of what the obligation is of the living towards the dead. No redemptive, restorative, even affirming relationship to the dead. The consequence is you're on your own, baby. Okay, so imagine this then as a set piece to give grief its full three-dimensional historical form. There are, of course, in my corner of the world, surviving remnants of the indigenous population, thank God, and thank them, I should say. And one of the consequences for them of waking up every day is they wake up in the presence of what they lost by virtue of the likes of you and I appearing here on the scene. The scale of it is almost unspeakable. And I don't know how anybody makes their way. And if we're talking about the grief sweepstakes, a contender for the winner of those sweepstakes would be the likes of you and I, who in North America wake up every day in the absence of what we lost. It's difficult to determine whose loss is more profound.
Yeah. I mean, it's, you know, from a personal history point of view, it's kind of interesting. You know, my family came from Prussia, which is a country that doesn't even exist anymore. And so with your work, it's always spoken to me, this idea of being an orphan to your history. And you don't know what you've even lost because no one can speak of it. And it's, you know, it's not on the same scale, but it's an interesting thing to kind of reckon with when you then have to deal with, I just had a child, and this idea that the unbroken line from generations, but you don't know, they kind of blur into, you know, mystery as to who these people were as a result of the machinations of European history, which was, tearing each other apart for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a strong thing to open up to. And so I guess that the question then is, what do you think brings people to come to this point of view where you're describing the kind of reckoning, or the kind of being open to these various losses of generational, multi-generational kind of civilization level losses? Like, again, many people just don't want to acknowledge it. It's far too painful. It becomes a reactionary, but I don't know who my ancestors are, who's crying for me. It's kind of becomes a very kind of broken down conversation, because it's just pain all the way down in many cases. How does someone start to make sense of that? What are the first steps that someone can do when they're thinking about engaging in these types of losses? You speak of indigenous nations and their cultural losses. We can think also of, the collective losses that we're experiencing now is it's happening right now. It's kind of these feel of the same flavor, maybe. I don't know how people can engage with it, basically.
Okay, there's a lot in there, and most of it wasn't a question. Most of it, properly so, was a kind of lament, And so I would say you've just modeled one beginning, although your characterization that it's sorrow and misery and misshapenness all the way down can't possibly be true. Right? There's a good amount of that, and there's other things besides. Okay, so my instinct has always been, always is a long term. My instinct for as long as I can remember has been to live alongside the frailties and the brokenness. We're having a kind of audio event, are we not, right now?
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Is that better?
How's that? Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, then. So if you begin with your poverties in a circumstance like we've just both been talking back and forth about, you can't really miss, which is to say, there are enough poverties to sustain any inquiry for a good long period of time. So just the odds are in your favor if you're willing to forego solutions and fixes and remedies and instant karma things and ceremonies and rituals borrowed from anywhere except where you come from, and on and on and on. And instead, imagine that you're no more impoverished by virtue of being willing to begin with your poverties. That's one. Two, most of your poverties are not personal. This is a huge leap for many Western people to make, because the lens that we've been encouraged to engage the world with is almost a hyper personalized lens, that nothing means anything until it means something to me, that you're nobody till somebody likes you on the keyboard. And it's a grim realization that the more tradition we have abandoned, the more frail and uncompelling our personal life has become. And this was not supposed to be what happened. What was supposed to be is our freedom from the confines of the dark edges of our collective history was supposed to be the great leap forward into some kind of light. And it was supposed to instantly and inevitably enable us to proceed that way. And there's nothing in the recent historical record that suggests that that's been the outcome. If anything, I'm mindful of a line written by John Berger, a well-known social critic who's just only recently dead. And his line was something, I hope I have the gist of it. He said, autobiography begins with the feeling of being alone. Yeah, and if you consider that in the context of that we're mad to make an autobiography of everything, then you realize the likelihood is that the reason for that instinct is because of a deep, unsettling, and incontrovertible sense that there's nobody really here. Yeah, hence the mania for identity politics and the constant ongoing reestablishment, redeclaration of who I am and why I am and how I can be me, and nobody else is to say anything about it. This is for me to decide, and all of that. That's poverty speaking, in my humble estimation. So I've lost track of your question, I think. And so I'm not answering it, but I'm probably speaking about something else that could bleed into the next question.
I think it does, because one thing I wanted to touch upon, and I guess it's this idea of, it's much commented on, and much understood about the sort of atomized, individualized kind of state of, okay, if we say Western societies, you know, the more advanced Western societies, or, you know, the English-speaking world particularly, there seems to be a kind of dot that connects to this idea of that you've written and talked about around elderhood. So we feel, if we are kind of atomized, individualized, we kind of burden ourselves with the responsibility of what would have been taken by a group, or taken by, you know, and understood generationally through other people, as I kind of think about it. And so this idea of elderhood and its role in supporting society in dealing with loss is something I'd like to kind of spend a moment on. Okay. Because we're fully in this pandemic. We've you know, it's affected everyone's families, our communities, the infrastructure of everyday life. And to me, it's very interesting that how our leaders, how our elders have simultaneously dealt with this incredibly harrowing situation. We're almost watching it like an experiment in real time, because it's kind of exposed the fragility of so-called strong men to effectively deal with power, and it's kind of recognized the compassionate, considered actions of female leaders around the world, the kind of the difference in how we've all dealt with it. And I feel like the US has kind of been, interestingly, had a benefit of a radical shift wherever anyone's politics, from Trump to Biden. And to me, if nothing else, Biden seems like an elder US statesman of the US establishment. He is an elder statesman of the establishment, but he's man kind of visibly scarred with his grief. And I kind of wonder, like, can you just kind of describe a little bit about the kind of role of the elder, you know, and its impact in society? Like, you talk of their absence, and I wonder, like, would their presence help us with to deal with the various types of losses that we experience?
Well, you know, my first thought is, what will we do with the answer to the question? If the answer is yes, then what? Because we remain in the circumstance that's the background of your question, which is that fundamentally we are awash in old people in the West. Okay? Once upon a time, not that long ago, the proliferation of old people meant a certain something. And its principal meaning and attribute was that the enabling circumstance, that is enough food, low-end strife, some kind of sense of semi-permanence of your way of life, all of these kind of things. These were, the proliferation of old people was a marker of those achievements, that kind of stability. What does it mean now that we're awash in old people? What about the stability? What about the sense of well-being? None of it is there, okay? So literally, the appearance on the street corner of more and more old people, or shuffling them off to the old folks' homes, where they die in remarkable rapidity from the virus. All of those things point to the fact that something fundamental has changed, and it's not demographic. My way of saying it in the book was, something has happened to elderhood on the way to age. Okay, so such that we can make the distinction now, sadly and somewhat savagely, but accurately, that the proliferation of old people does not contribute to the sagacity of the culture, the self-sustaining sanity of the culture by an increment of one.
Mhm.
You put them all in charge, you'll find out. Okay? Well, it's not what I'm recommending, but I'm suggesting to you this, that the absence of elderhood crosses the gender bias lines. There's no doubt about it. It's not as if old women are somehow, by definition of being women, not old and disabled in the same way old men are. Okay? The complete unwillingness in the West to abide by limits and by frailties and by endings has a consequence that no gender bias can begin to exhaust. That's what I'm suggesting here.
Mhm.
So then in terms of a quote beginning, it's the same answer as the last one. You begin with the fact that your elders are basically nowhere to be found. Not that they're in hiding, because the old people can't find them either. There's the great, stunning realization that, believe it or not, in my brief but intense sojourn on this planet, it appears to me in my corner of the world that old people are seeking elders in the same vain and involuntary way that people your age might be seeking them. In other words, it's an unchosen search. It's a search by default.
Mhm.
You exhaust every other possibility. Let's squeeze age and see what we can get from it. Is
Mhm.
basically what it comes down to. And, you know, old people self-designating as elders is very unbecoming of the office of elderhood. You may be familiar with a poem by Seamus Heaney, God bless him, called In the Republic of Conscience, or From the Republic of Conscience. It's an extraordinary meditation on exactly what we're talking about right now. And one of the things he recommends is that in the act of being inaugurated to be a president or a prime minister or whatever it is, that one of the obligations for that person is to weep publicly, as he says, for the, not assumption, for the arrogance, something like this, of holding office. And this is what elders frankly do. They weep for the unlikely merit that is accrued to them as a consequence of not dying yet, for one. And for two, it's this: how do we come by elders? My answer is by a sustained mayhem. That's how we come by them. But it's a mayhem that has to be made overt, and we have to become lucid about and craft a language where the vacancies appear instead of a language that banishes them in the hopes of feeling more comfortable about it. Very briefly, it could go like this. So you begin the life of your favorite wine with 100 gallons of grape juice, which is nobody's idea of a good time or a mellow event, right? My guess. And let's say 5 years later, or whatever it is, you have a remarkable vintage on your hands. How did that happen? My answer is, you started with 100 gallons, but you didn't end with 100 gallons. You can't get 100 gallons of fine wine from 100 gallons of grape juice. There's a mystery afoot, and one of the mysteries is diminishment by volume.
Mhm.
So you see, I apply the understanding to humans, and I say the way we come by our elder capacity is by diminishment. So there's less of us than there was when we started. But whatever it is that's there is all there. See, well, if you live in a culture that sneers at limits, and that's maniacal for growth, and that's competence addicted in the extreme, it's no surprise that nobody would take well to diminishment during the course of their middle years. Nobody would craft it as a kind of skillfulness. Nobody, in other words, would imagine that the grief of being a human being, limited and frail and time sensitive, could translate into wisdom and must translate into wisdom. So what do we have instead of wisdom of that kind? We have the prevalence and the tyranny of personal experience instead.
This idea of the prevalence of, no limits and no recognition of endings is kind of, at the heart of, and it set the seed for so much of our ills, right? And the to take and being sensitive to some of the things you just said a moment ago about the taking rituals from cultures other than your own. So I'm trying not to attach this to other kind of paradigms that are philosophies of the world from other cultures, but in the work that we're framing this around is there's an opportunity for us to engage with death and loss through an explicit understanding of renewal, and through the kind of the regenerative or natural kind of paradigms of growth, death, rebirth, the composting and hospicing of everything that happens. And it's kind of difficult, but we feel like a necessary process to kind of do this kind of work. And how it can filter down into people being able to kind of organize their lives in a sort of regenerative ways is a big ask. But can you kind of describe how, if I was to say accepting death through a process of renewal, is that something that would make sense to you? Can you kind of describe the process of decay that is necessary, and what do you think that means for a culture that doesn't do that? Can they move to that?
Okay. At the risk of sounding like an inelegant guest, I'd like to recommend to you that's lurking in your question, or the certain aspect of the question, is a kind of hopefulness that's not called for, is how I would put it, okay? Here's what I mean. Imagine you could try to ask the question you just asked me, but removing any reference to renewal. Okay. What would the question be now? You see? So here's what I'm saying to you by this observation. I'm obviously not playing got you. We're doing what we're born to do, which is to wonder aloud about something. And the beautiful thing about being able to wonder out loud is you don't have to be absolutely certain in order to do so. Mm-hmm. In fact, it helps to be a little disheveled, no? Okay, so yes, of course, the quote natural unquote observation you made about decomposition on the forest floor, and hoping that that would translate more or less inevitably and smoothly and cleanly into a similar iteration at a cultural level, leaves out, I think, one important detail. That it would not be clear to me that any living aspect of a demented culture goes to its demise willingly, naturally, inevitably, not kicking and screaming, and the rest. Mm-hmm. So the part that your formulation has left out is the idea that you're talking about something fundamentally involuntary occurring. Mm-hmm. And the problem with the use of the word natural is voluntary is right behind it. Mm-hmm. Natural means naturally occurring, means more or less inevitable, means should, means your mother would approve, means that's how they're selling you sustainable toilet paper. It's all the same, you see. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the thing about natural is, how about this? There's virtually nothing in the animal world that's old. Now, are we willing to sign up for that kind of natural? And we could go just on and on with the observations. Okay, so I suppose the thing I'm trying to resurface is this. If you can't proceed without hope, you are not a dependable adult human, especially in a time of crisis. And maybe this is a good time to talk about what the word crisis actually means. It doesn't mean something deeply unsought. It doesn't mean accident. It doesn't mean carnage. All of those associations are things we bring to it, and as such, much more illustrative of our prejudices than of the nature of what a crisis is. Okay, so etymologically, it's never a bad thing to do to go to the etymology of the word that you're enslaving with your prejudice and wonder about it and wonder how it changed. The word crisis simply means something like this. Okay, there were a range of possibilities once upon a time. That range has constricted for all kinds of reasons. You don't have that many options available to you anymore. That makes things more challenging and in a way clearer. Now, the paucity of options has resulted in a time of choice making, which is to say, you are now obliged to choose now that the wide openness of what you once imagined through your hope has properly collapsed into a serious reckoning of the actual realities of the time. In other words, what a crisis brings you is the opportunity to choose without having the ability to choose that. That's the only choice no longer available to you. It is upon you to choose. So hence crossroads, and I mean, etymologically, these things are related, no? Okay, so we're in a time of abject crises, more than one, right? One of them we've been talking about, well, we talked about several. Elderhood is in crisis, and its absence is itself a crisis for the rest of us. The refusal to be able to die on schedule, the unwillingness to look upon your death as a naturally occurring event that you owe to life, right? To sustain what would be sustained by your demise. I shouldn't occupy any more time. Let me segue to the next thing that you'd like to wonder about or say.
Well, I think I was just thinking, looking at some of the questions from the group, there was, and I'm just picking one of them because it was on my mind as well, is this relationship between hope and grief.
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes from you is from the video when you said, you know, we don't need hope to proceed, we need grief to proceed. And for me, it really stuck with me because it talks about the dark work that needs to happen. And I wonder if you can maybe elaborate a little bit more on that.
I don't know if the work itself is dark. It's certainly conducted in darkness. There's no question there. Well, hope. How does hope work? Not the hoped for thing. I'm not talking about the content. I'm talking about the mechanics, if you will, the irreducible consequences of being hopeful. What do they include? Do they include inevitable upside and a realization that suddenly everything is possible again? That's not what I've seen. What I've seen, particularly amongst people who are dying and who didn't want to be dying, is that they came to hope as a way of not dying while they were dying. You see, in other words, it's a strategy, is it not? Very much like acceptance is a strategy. What is it strategizing for? It's trading on the futures market. That's what hope does. Hope is the futures market. And the way I've said this before, and happy to say it again, is this. Here you and I are speaking. The only thing we don't need between us right now, in order to continue to do so, is our hope that we're sitting here speaking. It wouldn't even occur to us to hope that we were doing so. We might hope that the signal lasts. We might hope that we're vaguely entertaining or compelling to the people who are listening, but we're not hoping that we're talking, because the hope is absolutely unnecessary if you're willing to occupy the work of the present moment. So there you hear what I'm saying about it, right? Hope is entirely about what's not yet, about the future. And in a time of crisis, you don't need a future. You've got your hands full with the present. And while we're not talking about the past, let me be the past spokesman just for a second. Our elder problem is our time problem in the West, by which I mean this. You were probably educated, as I was, in the understanding that time has a momentum or a rhythm or a current. We often talk about it in water terms. And typically, almost inevitably, when I ask this question of people, and when I used to be able to ask anybody anything in public, it was, which direction does time go to? Which time does time flow towards?
Hmm.
Almost invariably, people would say the future.
Mhm.
The future is ahead of you. Apparently, you have more future than I do, given your age and given mine, right? And all that potential that allegedly goes with it. And all you have to do is live up to it,
Mhm.
and so on, and seize it by the neck, you know, and shake it for all it's worth and all the rest. Think about what constitutes the past. Everything that has ever been. That's what the past is, in time and in place, yeah? And which direction is time really going towards and bringing you to? And the answer seems to me, obviously, to be, we're heading in the same direction as everyone and everything else that's ever been. Are we not? Or are we exempting ourselves from that and heading off in some other direction? No, we're heading in the direction of what's been. Translation, we are heading towards the past. We're going to join the past, the conclave of all that has been. Yeah? That's the delivery. That's the way of contending with the samsara of the uncertainties of the present moment, is your reassurance that you're very unlikely to be left alone the way you have been in the present. When you finally acquire your past, the collective past that is part of your proper inheritance, your sense of who you are finally begins to dawn. And it only happens by virtue of the dissolution of the boundaries that made you the isolate you that you had so fondly become, let's say, no? Okay, so if we're heading to the past, we're heading towards the old people. We're heading towards the ancestors and so forth.
Mhm.
Okay, so what's become of them on our watch when we conducted ourselves as if there's no such thing? As if we come to the understanding of ancestorhood or the past as a matter of opinion.
Mhm.
What has become of them? You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And once you do the kind of involuntary psychic math of that question, it begins to dawn on you that the likelihood of your disappearance is almost a foregone conclusion by
Mhm.
virtue of your collective unwillingness to care for the past when it was your turn to do so.
Yeah.
And this contributes so immensely to the death phobia that I've spoken about probably too often.
And it's to pick up on that is the pressure or the kind of the awareness of, I don't know if any other generations in history have felt the kind of the when we try and position ourselves in future generations, we're given, almost a scientific outlook as to how bad it all will be. And so like, it feels like there's an end point, not an end point, but there's a very disturbing future that means that future ancestors, if we try and take a long-term view and we think of ourselves as ancestors in time, we can quickly get very despondent because we're like, well, we're the ones that they're going to hate. They're the ones that they're going to like really kind of want to bury us in history and forget all about it, and they're going to have to try and renew things in a different way. Mm-hmm. I kind of wonder, is that a particularly specific psychic problem almost, that we have to we've lost our ancestors, and we know as future ancestors that we've kind of really let everyone down a little bit.
Okay. Let's make a distinction then in the English language between loss and lost.
Mm.
Okay, it's not a distinction we often make, but let's try now. Loss, as a verb, it means what? Something that happened to you? Mm-hmm. No, it means something you did. Even though we use the term, I lost my father last year due to COVID. What we're not saying anything about what happened to my father or your father. We're saying what we did to them, basically by virtue of a regime of disinclination and neglect. Okay, that's how loss happens. We know that personally from losing our wallets and our car keys, but we don't seem to know it when it comes to losing our ancestors and our predecessors. See, now, if we continue to do so, we set into motion, or we sustain the motion then of the inability of the people who follow us to be able to emulate an example of what it looks like to live in the present moment as if the past is so, which is to say, live out the obligations that are inherent in the arrangement. See?
Mhm.
Lost, on the other hand, doesn't characterize what we did. It characterizes our deep unwillingness to be where we are. That's what I understand lost as an adjective to mean. It doesn't mean you don't know where you are. It means you don't want to be there.
Mhm.
It's an expression of preference,
Mhm.
not an expression of dislocation.
Hmm.
See? If it were just a matter of dislocation, we'd be lost, baby, times lost, and forget about it. See? But the good news is, no matter how you feel about your dislocation, what's within your abilities is the capacity to inhabit the moment you inelegantly and reluctantly are bestowed with. And that becomes the example that the future people can attend to. You see, it's not the content of your work as a generation, it's your willingness to take up the work of your generation that becomes the example that your followers can follow, that those following you, in other words, I don't mean follow in the social media sense, I mean to come after, no? This is an enormously compelling proposition that has no hope in it whatsoever. No hope required.
Mm.
Okay, so how about this? You've recently become a parent, although you put it this way, I had a child, and I was going to say you're looking remarkably well considering
Exactly.
the anomaly of the thing. But anyway, so you've had a child, and you are now, in my language, a parentling.
Mm.
Okay? That means a newborn parent.
Mm-hmm. Very much.
Okay, trying to braille your way through insomnia and various other things. But of course, aside from all the jokes, is the ongoing phenomenological reality that you don't know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But one of the things that's risen up in the place of your deep alleged certainty about what it means to be a parent is the instinct to want to protect and defend at all costs against all comers, including viruses, including economic and ecological collapse and every other damn thing. And it's a remarkably stilling event when you begin to keep track of what's rising in you as a consequence of the appearance, yet again, of another protein unit, for the moment masquerading as a human. Okay? So here's the question then. You want to protect your child against this mean old world.
Mm-hmm.
Though, of course, the world is not that mean, but the meanness certainly derives from what we've done with it and the meaning that we've wrung from it. Yes. So how can you do that then? Do you grow a 6-foot square bubble of safety and security around that child and have their health be the first casualty of doing so, and their psychic sense of belonging to the world the second casualty of doing so, and so on? Well, many people are in the act of doing that as we speak, I'm sure.
Sure.
My suggestion would be this: you cannot act directly on behalf of your child if your project is to make the world less injurious to them than it would otherwise be. The work that you have to undertake is indirect. That means on behalf of your child, you work for a better day. And that's the interruption of the positive feedback loop of the thing, is what you have to live with as an adult and as a parent. You can't protect them against the world that you didn't change when you had the chance. Okay? So what you're left with is you work on behalf of a better day now in hopes that in some wild surrogacy, the benefits of you so doing can also accrue to your child while they accrue to a lot of other people's kids and the non-human world while we're at it.
Yeah.
That's the throwdown, right? Of really being willing to be grief encrusted and grown up and literate in terms of grief, and the unwillingness to engage in the great grief bypass, which is hope and being positive.
Thank you, Stephen. I mean, the lasting image of taking up the work and doing the work is such a powerful invitation.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I tried to fold in some questions from everyone. I hope I'll apologize for the fact that we're out of time and that we haven't had a chance to specifically go through questions, but I'm seeing lots of conversation in the chat, and I appreciate everyone's kind of engagement on this. Stephen, it's been a real pleasure and a real privilege to speak to you.
Thank you. And you know, the invitation is extremely honoring. It really is. I must say the mutual willingness to proceed as if something I say or could think of could possibly be useful in a time such as this is, I mean, it's overwhelming at a certain level. The privilege of intruding into other people's lives and the guardedness with which I try to do it is the least I can come up with on short notice to earn my keep, so to speak. And I'll just say farewell to everyone, yourself included, with this. You've been very kind in your questions because very few of them have been flattering, either to me personally or to the circumstance we find ourselves in. And that's entirely proper. You don't need to be reaffirmed right now, in my humble estimation. We need to be firmed right now, yeah? And the obligation to stand and deliver when the opportunity presents itself is one of those moments when you find out if you've been spinning your wheels, wasting your time, or being engaged in a degree of self-involvement that's indefensible. So you've rescued me from all of that temporarily just by asking me a few questions. And it honors not just me personally, but all the circumstances in which I was able to learn the things I tried to talk about today, and those people that were included in them, and those eras that have now passed. So on their behalf, I thank you and the people in your organization for the privilege of stealing an hour or so of your time for the sake of wondering.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
I'll just say to everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight, for spending an hour in conversation. Thank you to Iona in the background. This video will be released on the Stewarding Loss website, and we'll be passing it to you as well, Stephen. Just to say to everyone that this is the first of a whole series of events. The next, on the 28th of May, is with Jake Garber, who works in the realm of social imagination and the notions of death and loss. And then coming soon after that will be Farzana Khan from Healing Justice London. She'll be in conversation with Cassie, and I'll be speaking with Dr. Tamara Waranchinsky from Radical Death Studies in the US. Stephen, thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.